Okay, this video won't be about a single aspect of respondent conditioning, but just a few phenomena and details that go along with it and will help cement our understanding. We'll start by considering something Pavlov might have run into in his initial experiments. So imagine one of Pavlov's dogs had a metronome playing in its kennel since it was born. Maybe one just happened to be in the room. So it's really used to that sound, right? It's a neutral stimulus, but something that's very familiar. Then, when Pavlov tried to train that dog by pairing metronome plus meat, CS plus US, do you think this dog would start salivating to the metronome more or less than other dogs who didn't grow up with the metronome sound in their kennel? Would it take more training or less for the metronome to start eliciting a CR for this dog? Maybe pause the video for a moment and make your prediction. So it turns out there's something called the CS pre-exposure effect, which is that it's harder to acquire associations for a neutral stimulus if it's already familiar. In other words, it's harder to turn something into a conditioned stimulus if that thing is a familiar part of your world already. For a real life example, if I've used a particular ringtone for years, it's a lot harder to start associating that ringtone with my girlfriend. But if I use one that I've never used before, a ringtone that's totally unfamiliar, I'll start to associate it with her much quicker, much more strongly. So a pro tip actually to create new associations through respondent conditioning, if you're trying to create associations, is to use an unfamiliar stimulus to pair with the US. If you're trying to train your dog or your cats to know, oh, this is the time of day when I get fed, right? You might play a sound right before you feed them. Use a sound that won't come up in other times that they won't have heard before. Don't use your familiar, text notification. Now, here's some data from an animal experiment on this very effect. So on the left here is how strong the association is. That's what we have on the y-axis, right? In other words, how much of a conditioned response we're getting. And at the bottom on the x-axis, we've got how many trials it took to get that much of a response, that much learning. In other words, how many times we've paired the CS plus the US together. You can see for the control group, the dotted line here, they had never been exposed to the CS previously. It was a brand new stimulus to them, and this is how long it took to reach asymptote for this particular species and this particular learning. There's around 400 trials or so on this data. Now, look at the plain green line. That's subjects that had been pre-exposed to the CS in other contexts. So without any US showing up, it was just a thing they had seen or heard before. Then, when the acquisition phase for respondent conditioning actually started and the CS was getting paired with the US over and over and over again, we can see that it took way more trials before the CS was causing much response. But also in this case, it limits the potential learning such that the asymptote, the maximum limit for potential learning, doesn't go as high. It doesn't get to the normal height. So that would be the CS, conditioned stimulus, pre-exposure effect, the effect of having seen the conditioned stimulus or experienced it previously. But what about something similar where you've been exposed to the US prior to acquisition starting, the unconditioned stimulus? Well, there's also something called the US pre-exposure effect, where it's harder to acquire associations for an unconditioned stimulus that's already familiar. For example, if a dog has gotten this particular meat without a bell for years, right? It's just a meat that it's always had before that it's used to, then the bell plus meat training over and over again will go slower than if that meat was a new food for this dog. Or another example would be, if I've been shocked randomly once a day since birth, that would suck. Hopefully it doesn't happen. But if that had been happening my whole life, random shocks throughout the day, it'll be much harder for me to notice when a blue light starts pairing up with a shock, when a blue light starts predicting the shock, compared to someone who just started getting the blue light plus shock combination. So for both the CS and the US, we'll get the most learning if everything is new to us, if the stimuli are novel, and we'll get less learning or slower learning if we're suddenly faced with the pairing of stimuli we've dealt with before in other contexts, but which didn't have that pairing previously. All right, now we've been talking about pairing up the CS and the US to create respondent conditioning, but how do you time those relative to each other? Like if you're actually trying to do this with your dog or something else, how long do you put those stimuli apart? Does it matter? Is there a difference between bell plus meat, bell plus meat, bell plus meat, and meat plus bell, meat plus bell, meat plus bell? Does it matter which comes first? Well, it turns out the order and the timing does make quite a bit of difference. So one way you could set things up when you're pairing the CS and the US over and over and over again is what's called delay timing. With delay timing or delay conditioning, the CS occurs first. And then while it's still happening, while it's still present, the US shows up shortly afterward. So they kind of overlap with delay conditioning. But with the CS happening first as a sort of prediction that the US is coming, it's about to happen. So this is usually the most effective timing for getting respondent conditioning. And furthermore, the delay between the start of the CS and the start of the US does make a difference. It's called the CS-US interval, and changing it can change how quickly or how well learning occurs. So just for one example, the graph here shows actual data from eye blink conditioning in rabbits. So if the CS, the conditioned stimulus, like the warning that you're about to get a puff of air into your eye, maybe there's a tone that plays. If that CS, that tone comes about 300 milliseconds before the US, so 0.3 of a second before the puff of air into the eye, then you'll get maximal learning. But if the CS, the warning, shows up and then there's a 2.5 second delay, a 2,500 millisecond delay, the rabbit isn't going to respond to the CS nearly as much, so the learning is weaker. So while delay conditioning is definitely the best kind of timing to use, the amount of the delay also does matter. And of course, for different species and different situations, you just have to test empirically to find what that sweet spot is where you get the maximum learning. Now, there are other ways we could set things up, of course, other than delay timing. Another setup is called simultaneous timing or simultaneous conditioning, which, not surprisingly, means that the US and the CS occur at the same time. Basically, they overlap completely. One always shows up right with the other at the same time. Unfortunately, this leads to weaker learning than delay conditioning. It makes sense when you realize in this situation, the conditioned stimulus provides no helpful predictive information that the US is coming. It's not predictive of anything biologically salient or useful. It's just a kind of sidekick that's along for the ride. So yes, our brain will still make the association eventually, but not as easily and not as strongly. Okay, then there's something kind of similar to delay timing. This one still works, but we call it trace timing because it relies on a memory trace. So in trace timing or trace conditioning, the CS happens and then it finishes, it stops, it goes away, then some time passes. That's the trace of memory has to kind of go through this time before the US starts up. Again, this isn't as ideal as delay timing. It doesn't get as good a learning. There are a couple of intuitive reasons for that if you think about it. Like, for one thing, we're now often dealing with a longer time period between the start of the CS and the start of the US. So usually we're talking about a longer CS-US interval here. But also, it requires that memory trace, which isn't a necessary component for delay conditioning. So that could introduce some error. And in general, there may be a more broad reason why trace conditioning is worse, in the sense that we might have evolved to find patterns kind of most naturally in things that occur close together in time, what we might call contiguity or closeness in time. And while there is some evidence for that contiguity idea, the closeness in time being really important, probably a more important element for learning comes not from contiguity, but from contingency, meaning from one stimulus being contingent on the other. In other words, on the predictiveness that I talked about before. That's probably what's most important. Now, with trace conditioning, a longer trace interval means weaker conditioning as well. That's kind of obvious, but the longer you have to wait, the longer that memory is required to be there, the worse this works. Okay. Finally, there is another way you could set things up for respondent conditioning, although this one kind of doesn't make as much intuitive sense and honestly doesn't work as well. So there's something called backward conditioning or using backward timing. In this case, the unconditioned, the reflexive stimulus actually shows up first which of course is just going to cause its natural unconditioned response, like the reflex happens, but then afterward, a CS will show up. So you can see why it's called backward conditioning. And usually this results in pretty poor learning. There's no predictiveness here. There's no contingency where the US only happens after the CS has given you a warning. Nope. In this case, the warning comes after it's already too late. But still, our brain can pick up on that association, just definitely not as easily and not as quickly. So backward conditioning would mostly be seen in a few rare examples, usually involving biologically relevant conditioned stimuli. So a classic example you might read would be like a prey animal that, without any warning, gets attacked by a predator. Okay, so the pain it feels all of a sudden, that's an unconditioned stimulus. The pain shows up first, but then maybe moments later, the animal sees the predator. And later, maybe it has some fear if it sees that kind of predator again, because that's the stimulus that showed up close in time to the unconditioned pain stimulus it experienced. But in this case, right, the vision, the visual, the seeing it showed up after the pain. So maybe a better example, probably the best example of backward conditioning, comes from laboratory studies that can control stimuli and timing really carefully experimentally. So a classic study in the 70s, they actually had rats just eating food in a chamber. They're just chilling, having a nice snack, when suddenly the rat got shocked, just out of the blue, got shocked, felt some pain. Afterwards, the lights go off for a few seconds. Then what happens? Surprise! The lights come back on, and a toy hedgehog has been placed in the room. And interestingly, these rats developed a fear of the toy hedgehog, even though the frickin' hedgehog didn't predict the shock at all. It actually came after the shock. Now, that said, despite this being kind of a convincing example, like backward conditioning can happen, it does exist, you won't find a lot of examples of backward conditioning because, once again, at best, you've got contiguity or closeness in time, but you don't have contingency, where the US only happens once the CS has occurred as a predictive warning or a signal. That can't happen with backward conditioning. All right, so delay conditioning, delay timing is the best. There's one last concept I want to touch on in this video before we move on. There is a particular example of respondent conditioning that we call conditioned taste aversion. This is where an animal, including us humans, but any animal, can quickly learn to associate a particular taste with later symptoms of sickness, specifically the kinds of sickness symptoms that are related to toxic or poisonous substances or spoiled food. So, just for example, let's say you put some sugar in water. You make some sweetened water, okay? So you do sweet water and you pair it with maybe a nausea drug, something you put in the water that leads to vomiting or sickness later on. We'll probably do this with some rats, not some humans in our experiment. But in this situation, what happens? If you do this, the rats avoid sweet water. Not only do they start to dislike the sweet water, they actually dislike it after one trial. If they drink sweet water, especially if it's for the first time they've experienced sweet water, and then they get sick a little later, they get nausea, they vomit, then they're going to stay away from sweet water. And all it took was getting sick one time at the old sweet water saloon, and they never want to go back. So what makes this conditioned taste aversion so interesting is that, unlike most respondent conditioning, that learning can occur after just one trial. So that's unusual. And unlike most respondent conditioning, it works even with a longer interval. So generally with this conditioned taste aversion, a 30-minute delay between the taste and the feeling sick, that has the strongest conditioning, the strongest aversion that you'll find to that taste afterward. But it actually works even if some hours have passed between eating and getting sick, which makes sense from a biological standpoint when you think about it. It can take some time for poison or spoiled food to create those symptoms of sickness. So the only way a creature like us or other animals could ever learn what foods to avoid is if we're able to make connections over fairly long periods of time, at least when it comes to food stimuli and sickness symptoms. Now, what's interesting is that the taste that becomes aversive, the taste that becomes disliked or unpleasant, it doesn't have to have actually been the cause of the sickness. So a familiar example for those who might drink alcohol, let's say orange juice and vodka combined together. That's a common drink, right? Orange juice plus vodka. If you drink a lot of that, it might lead to later puking, right? If you go overboard and binge. So orange juice and vodka showed up first, later puking happened. Now, we know that the alcohol caused the puking. The orange juice had nothing to do with it, right? But our subject may find orange juice becomes unappealing after this experience. Maybe even just after one really bad experience, it's enough to turn you off to orange juice, even though the orange juice isn't the actual cause, right? It's just some stimulus that was there and kind of salient and stood out, a taste that had happened a little bit prior to that feeling sick. Or for another example, let's say it's your first time eating sushi and you coincidentally get sick later. Totally unrelated to the sushi. It wasn't the sushi, right? It's likely if this happens, you'll find sushi unappealing after that, right? It was your first time eating it and you happen to get sick that day. Your brain will make the connection even if you don't consciously make it. Now, conditioned taste aversion like this, it happens less if the taste or the food involved is familiar. For example, if I eat this same sushi all the time without getting sick, if I go to this restaurant every week of my life, I've never gotten sick before, then when I do get sick after eating the sushi, probably something else would have caused it, right? It's not going to make me hate sushi after one experience in that case. The brain just doesn't make that connection because I'm so used to that sushi. My question for you is, can you guess why? So pause and speculate on an explanation based on a term we've learned previously. Well, okay, this shouldn't really be that surprising based on the CS pre-exposure effect, because it's harder to make associations for a stimulus we've already had lots of experience with. So if you've had a lot of experience with sushi before, you've eaten in this restaurant a bunch of times, then getting sick 3 hours later isn't as likely to make you averse to sushi, to make you hate sushi, compared to someone who didn't have that pre-exposure, someone who had never had sushi before, and then their first time, they got sick 3 hours later. So that's an example of the CS pre-exposure effect. Now, given that conditioned taste aversion is somewhat of an exceptional example to respondent conditioning, right? It's a little unusual because it's for this important evolutionary survival mechanism of avoiding poison and finding safe food. Given that, it may not be surprising that taste aversion also shows us some limitations of respondent conditioning for similar biological reasons. So what we find when we try various experiments involving aversion learning is that some associations are easier to make than others. It's easier for our brain to make some connections than others. So, for example, it's fairly straightforward with our sushi scenario. Sushi led to nausea 3 hours later, especially if it's your first time with sushi. Led to 3 hours later this one time, and now I experience a conditioned disgust reaction to sushi in the future. That all makes sense. But what if there was also jazz music playing in the sushi restaurant when I ate there 3 hours before getting sick? Maybe it's my first time in this restaurant and I'm hearing jazz music at the same time. Will I also find jazz music aversive now? Will I hate jazz music because it happened to show up a few hours before getting sick? The answer is no. That doesn't seem to happen. Not even if it was your first time hearing jazz music ever. The music happened hours before the sickness, and the brain doesn't as easily associate things that far apart unless it's a taste and the kind of symptoms we get from bad food or poison. It's limited to this one super biologically relevant situation and not a general type of learning that can take place over such a long time period. So, a classic example of this effect was actually discovered in some rats that were exposed to radiation that made them feel sick. This was part of a different experiment. It was done for some other purposes, not specific to a learning experiment, but the researchers noticed something weird. Those rats that had been, exposed to radiation without knowing it, those rats mysteriously stopped drinking from plastic water bottles. Question is why? Well, it turns out the mystery is kind of solved when they realized the home cage for these rats, where they lived most of their day, had glass water bottles in it. Rats were just fine with that. But the test cage, where they were getting irradiated, where the radiation was going into them, even though they didn't know that was happening, happened to have plastic bottles there, which gave the water just a slightly different taste. So in this case, the radiation is what actually made them sick, But of course, they can't taste or see or sense the radiation in any way directly, but they did happen to taste something distinct a while before they got sick each time. They tasted plastic bottle water and then got sick later from the radiation. But the brain was predisposed to look for a taste-related cause for their nausea earlier in the day. Hence that association with the plastic bottles, which they then showed an aversion for. They avoided, they disliked the plastic bottles. This insight actually led to a really famous study by Garcia and colleagues, where they showed that we have a certain biological predisposition to associate some types of stimuli together. For example, like we've seen, tastes can easily come to be associated with nausea that happens afterwards, but it's actually much harder to connect a taste to experiencing a shock later on. They don't come to fear the taste even if the taste comes before getting shocked. Alternatively, it's easier to associate a sound with a shock, right? A shock that happens after the sound, than it is to associate a sound with a feeling of nausea that happens afterward. They're much more likely to fear or avoid the sound later on if it was a shock that came after it. So what this shows us is that even for such a universal phenomenon as respondent conditioning, there are certain details which depend on the creature's biological predispositions and evolutionary history. Not all learning is created equal, and some things are easier to learn than others when it comes to respondent conditioning. All right, we've got 2 more videos for respondent conditioning after this. In the next one, we'll get into higher order conditioning, where we associate things with things we've already made associations with, and some other kind of complex real-world situations like that. And then we'll end with a video about a theoretical model that brings all of this respondent conditioning stuff together into a more simple and elegant framework.